Welcome to Decoded by Christina, a series where each video will focus on one HTML or CSS concept. Today, I'm going to talk about animating with the CSS transition property. Let's get started. The CSS transition property does what it sounds like. It creates transitions. But more specifically, it can be used to control the animation speed when changing the CSS of an element as it moves from one state to another, such as changing the color of the text when hovering over a link. Changing the state of an element usually requires some kind of user interaction like scrolling down the page or clicking on an object. Usually, this requires JavaScript, but there is a way to create CSS-only interactions with pseudoclasses. A CSS pseudoclass is a special keyword added to a selector to define a specific state of an element. A common pseudoclass is hover, used to change the style of the element when a user hovers over it with their mouse. Let's take a look at an example. And if you'd like to follow along, the link to this code pen is in the video description. I personally like to put my code panels on the left by changing the editor layout under Change View, but you can keep the default layout if you prefer. Also note that when using CodePen, it auto-refreshes when you make a change to the code, so you don't have to save or reload the page. But if you want to save a copy, then select the fork option and make sure you have an account. Right now, this example just has a link within a paragraph. By default, links are blue and displayed with an underline. A common style convention is to change the underline style. I'm going to start by removing the underline using text decoration line set to none. Then on hover, I'll add the underline back in by setting text decoration line to underline. You can delete the / and asterisk to uncomment the code, or use the keyboard shortcut, Command / for Macs or Control / for PCs. So now, when you hover over the link, the underline is applied instantaneously. You could also do the reverse and leave the underline as is, then remove it on hover. But later, when we add the transition, it will be easier to see the effects if we add the underline on hover instead. Let's add another common hover style, which is changing the text color. I'll start by changing the default color. Then I'll change the color on hover as well. I'm also going to add the font weight set to bold, just to make it stand out a little bit more for demonstration. Now, the color and the underline will change styles on hover. For demos, I like to use keyword values for the color property, but you can also use the hex or RGB value if you'd like. You could also alternatively use the shorthand text decoration property, which combines text decoration line, text decoration color, text decoration style, and the newer text decoration thickness property. These types of style changes on hover are a pretty common way of indicating to the user that this bit of text is a link. For these types of hover interactions, I like to use the transition property to add a subtle change between the styles. Back in the example, I'll uncomment the transition style so we can see how this affects the hover style changes. Now, we can see the text and the underlined color slowly transition from one color to another. But there is no gradual change showing for the underline style. That displays right away, just like it did before we added the transition style. And that's because not all CSS properties are affected by the transition property. Let's come back to this example after we talk a little bit more about how this works. Transition is actually shorthand for 4 subproperties. The transition property and transition duration must be defined for this style to work. Transition timing function and transition delay are optional. The transition property determines which CSS property will be applied by specifying the property name, such as color or font size. Only the properties named here are animated during the transition. Any change to any other properties will occur instantaneously, which is the default behavior. To apply a transition to more than one property, the values can be separated by a comma or use the keyword all to apply the transition effect to all the properties that can be transitioned. As we saw in this example, some properties such as text decoration line can't be transitioned because there is no sort of in-between state for the property to show a gradual change. Either the line is there or it isn't. A style like color does have in-between values that the browser can define as it's changing from one color to another. And by default, the color of the underline follows the color of the text. So while the line shows right away, the color of the line is transitioning in. There are alternative ways to create a style that look like the underline is expanding from left to right, but that involves using other properties instead of text decoration, which I won't be focusing on in this video, but you can view the description for links to extra resources. There are many other ways to style the link. You could also use a different color for the underline with the text decoration color property. If you're using the shorthand text decoration property, just add the color value. We can also just remove the underline style and stick to only changing the color, since that property can be transitioned. To see a full list of which CSS properties can be used with transition, check out this resource from the Mozilla Developer Network. Now that we've looked at how to define the property to be transition, the next step is to set the length of time to complete the change using the transition duration property. Set the value using seconds with the S unit or milliseconds with the MS unit. You can use whole numbers or decimals. So let's update the transition duration in the CodePen example. I'm using the shorthand syntax here, so the first value is the transition property set to all. So any property that can be transitioned will be applied. I'll also update the second value, which is the transition duration, to 0.25 seconds to shorten the animation speed and make the effect a little more subtle. You don't need to add the 0 before the decimal point, but I find that adding it makes it easier for me to read. If you prefer to use milliseconds, then set it to 250 ms. Now let's talk about this third value, ease in, which is the transition timing function value. This property is used to set an acceleration curve of the transition by varying the speed over the duration of the change from one style to the other. It can be used with a variety of keywords or function values. The keywords are based on Bezier curves, specifically cubic Bezier curves, which uses 4 points to define the acceleration pattern. Let's take a closer look at the different options detailed here in the MDN documentation. There are lots of online resources, but I personally like MDN the best, so you'll see me refer to them a lot. Let's start by hovering over the first example, linear. This value creates a transition at an even speed for the duration of the animation. Now I'll hover over the ease in example, which is what I used in my CodePen example. With this value, the acceleration will start slowly, easing in. Then the speed will increase until it's complete. If we look under the values section, the keyword values and their corresponding cubic Bezier function values are listed. Declaring this property is optional, so if you don't, it will default to ease. You can also create your own using the cubic Bezier function instead of the keywords. There is also a steps function that allows you to define a transition for adding stops during the transition. Scroll down a bit further to see examples. Personally, I like to keep it simple when using this property and generally stick to one of the ease or function keywords. However, these options can be useful for creating more advanced transition animations. The fourth property, which I haven't added to my CodePen example yet, is transition delay, used to delay the start of the animation, and is defined with seconds or milliseconds as well. A positive value will delay the start of the transition. A negative value will begin the transition immediately, but also partway through the animation, as if it had already been running for the length of time defined. This property is also optional, and if it's not declared, there will be no delay at the start of the animation. Let's go back to the CodePen example. Since I'm using the shorthand syntax here, when using a transition delay value, make sure to add it anywhere after the transition duration value. I'll set it to 2 seconds so we can really see the delay. 1, 2, start. The transition property is added to the element before the changes start. So in this example, the hover effect triggers the change. So the transition property should be added to the link class to define the behavior before the changes begin. The styles added to the link class with the hover pseudo class indicate what the styles should be at the end of the transition. Take some time to experiment with these different values and different properties to find the perfect combination for your transitions. Don't forget to check the description below for links to everything I've mentioned and a couple extra resources. That wraps up this edition of Decoded by Christina. In the next video, I'll be talking about animating with keyframes, which will allow for more complex animation patterns. And if you're interested in taking a full online course, check out my CSS Essential training on LinkedIn Learning. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to get updates. Until next time, bye!